So in this session, we're actually just going to show you, three different ways. In my case, I use two. I use two because I made some terrible, terrible mistakes early on. Let's get to it. Yes. Now this is my basic philosophy when it comes to assigning permissions. And I always said things like, setting up permissions, it's kind of like playing pool or playing goalie on a pool table. Because you never know where something's going to come from. But basically there are three possible, and I'm not going to say they're the only ones, but basically the vectors from which something can go wrong. And that would be malice, which is incredibly rare. There is mischief, uncommon, and then there's whoopsie, which is way the most, by far the most common. Was I not supposed to do that? So I try to set things up so that they're fairly they're simple, and that people don't really have to ask that question too often. And I learned from a previous ILS that I can rely a great deal on staff members' complete disinterest in, learning somebody else's job. So, the Lego model that I began with was that everything in the library that we had, every permission, every view permission would be given to every staff member. And that would be the biggest piece they had. And then we would have the things for general work, regular or student staff, and, what I, in my advanced years, now refer to as the grown-ups. And so, the people who are, kind of maybe, supervisory or what have you. And then there's the restricted permissions that apply to, only the people who really, really need to know this. Part of it is that there was a lot of dovetailing between here and between there. And so it was very hard to nail down with any specificity how I should break this up. So I just had a bucket model. And this one was all the view permissions, and then there was a separate bucket for all of the permissions for a particular app. And these, if you're familiar, if you've heard people talking about APIs over this conference, basically, I was using the API calls. This was very early, and I was having a hard time finding what all of the individual permissions did. So I just, for the sake of expediency, for the testers, I just grabbed every get permission there was, and I put it in one bucket. And then I took all of the other permissions and I put them in another bucket. So there was get, and then there was get plus everything else. I began sort of separating things out as far as you can view fees and fines, and then you can do things with fees and fines. So I started breaking it down that way. Now, big problem. And I think that it has to do with if we mentioned get permissions, I was using the APIs individually. I had, downloaded all the APIs, and I had picked up everything that had get at the end, and I put it into a set. And then I took all of them and I put them into another set. And then I was like, oh, does it start with, fees and fines and end with get? Then I'm putting it in the bucket. And so I spent a great deal of time doing this work. This is kind of what it looks like. This is, something that I put together, and I sorted it and everything. This is the tiniest fraction of the second version of Folio. And I, honest to God, would go through all of these and go, this one goes here, this one goes there, this one goes here, this one goes there. It is a dumb idea. Especially since if you're gonna move to the next version and things are gonna change and they're gonna be added and whatever, this is crazy. So the Seder option, Folio comes with permissions that come, that comes with them, it's kind of out of the box. If you do what I do, because I still download the whole thing, and I look at them in the JSON, and you can tell if they come from Folio because they're referred to, there's a quality called mutable. And so if it is immutable, that means it comes from Folio. And it can't be changed or updated or whatever, it's just what has come. And it lists, the API calls that are in there when you look at the JSON. But if it is mutable, then that's basically something you made yourself and you didn't know. So if mutable means that you could change it. If it is a mutable permission, that means that you've made something, and so it can be changed. So you can use the out-of-the-box permissions. They're great. They do a lovely job, and you can create these things and put them into permission sets. And permission sets can be added to other permission sets. You can nest them all the way down if you want. I use the Folio permissions to create sets that fulfill a function. And that's, I try to do it in a very basic way. Create a bib record, create and edit a bib record, whatever. And then I take those sets, I take those functions, and I put them into roles so that we can have student workers in circulation and we can have full-time staff in interlibrary mode and, everywhere else. So for instance, our interlibrary loan department is now called document delivery. And the student worker has these permissions that, these functions that I have defined. Simple circulation was basically for me, just check in and check out. There's another one called circulation, which has a little bit more to it. Everything related to holds and requests, because they needed those. They're allowed to view fees and fines. And here you see inventory : create, view, edit items. That's one of those signals, if you're looking at a list of permissions in the UI, that it's one of the immutable permissions that came with Folio. So if you want to make your own and you want to be able to easily tell which ones are the ones you've made and which ones are the ones that came with Folio, that's a great way to do it. Just don't put any colons in your permission set names. This is a permission set that's been broken out. So you saw previously the document delivery student had simple circulation. These are the individual immutable permissions that come with Folio. And this is what they're allowed to do. They can take actions and they can look at things and they can, deal with user loans. So that's what that looks like. So you can see that it's kind of like it breaks down into greater granularity. So now, what I can get, because ever since I started working with this, I think it's been 25 years. But what would happen is someone would say, I have a new student, give them the permissions. And they would have zero further indication as to what they wanted. And so for about 20 years, I would have to get someone to give me the name of someone who already works there, who has the same, who does the same work, and I would just copy the permissions. Now, at last, someone can say, I have a new student, I have a new student worker. this is their name, this is their network ID, and give them the proper folio permissions, and I can. I know, because I've called this particular set document delivery student. They have student, they're a document delivery, there you go. And that is all I need now. And so this, as opposed to a series of API calls, makes much more sense. And I believe, yep, was that it? Yep. All right, so that is learning from my mistakes. Don't do it.
So next,
May I ask a couple of questions?
oh, yeah, let's do questions first.
Do you then grant them the permission set in the Folio UI, or do you use an API call?
Right now, I'm granting them in the UI. And partly it's so that someone else can do it without really having to get into the weeds. But it's also fairly easy. But you can also assign it through, in fact, when I had the permission sets made up entirely of APIs, I made a script that would grab every active user ID and then find their user ID in Folio users, and then find their user ID and permissions, and then assign them all a particular set. So it's possible, but I guess personally I associate it with a dumber thing in my past. So yes.
When, as an example, you have this simple circulation permission set, you obviously have something that goes beyond simple circulation. Do you then use some kind of advanced circulation and include all the individual permissions that are part of the simple permission set? Or do those people get assigned the simple circulation and the additional circulation function set?
Yes, I have not put simple circulation inside the circulation set.
Yeah.
It's possible, but I also don't want anyone to think that like, I don't want anyone to think that they're missing out on anything. So instead of saying simple circulation and advanced, I would label this simple circulation and complicated circulation, which would scare a lot of people away. So.
Yeah.
That's-
Is it possible that when you switch to another release, that the permissions change and that you have to do it again, or?
Yes, yes, with each new release, the release notes will tell you if there are new permissions, if there are changed permissions, and if there are deprecated permissions. And so you could get a sense of like, if this permission that you are currently employing with 3 roles is deprecated, typically what that means is that it's been sort of broken out into more granular permissions. And so if you understood that this was not ideal, but maybe we don't want them to be able to delete that, and we're just trusting them not to. Instead, when things get more broken out, we can go ahead and do it. But it does require, for me, it's a couple of weeks looking at it, online through our pre-testing period.
I just wanted to add to what you said, Anya, and like it's also just realised for me how like important the naming and how you organise it. Because your question was a good one. I think like it's 6 and 2 3s, you can do both, but that is not that technically you can do both. But I'm wondering also for me like what is more helpful for everything in my institution to say that a role that corresponds to what we have on our website is like, and then they know. Like this is the permission set for that role, or is it easier to, as you said, so that people know, like, don't have to look at the giant list and understand what they're able to do, to have simple circulation and then circulation plus, or maybe like circulation for this location and stuff like that. So just generally how do I want to name and organize things to, I guess, avoid questions later on?
Yes. Any other questions?
All right, then we're gonna move to our next presenter, Erin Weller, who's online with us. So Erin, I can flip through the slides for you. Just let me know
Perfect.
when you need me to. And is this loud enough for everyone to hear? Maybe Erin, say something.
Can you hear me?
Is that good? Okay.
Okay, excellent. I'm Erin Weller with Michigan State University. Christine Tobias is with you in the room. Unfortunately, I couldn't be there, but I'll be presenting, and Christine might have to take the questions just because I'm having a really hard time hearing the audience, but she's there, so we'll get through this. You can click to the next slide. So while Maura is the keeper of permissions at the University of Chicago, we actually have a team at Michigan State. When we implemented Folio, we formed the User Management Working Group. And this is 4 different library staff are on a distribution list. And we work together very closely with unit heads and supervisors to determine what staff's permissions needed to be in the various units. And we did decide to rely heavily on the permission sets that Maura had just talked about. We do share a Folio tenant with the Library of Michigan, so it was really important for us to distinguish which permission sets were theirs and which were ours. So we just kept it real simple. If it's an MSU permission set, it starts with MSU. If it's Library of Michigan, it starts with LM. So it's really easy for us to tell and keep those apart. And so that was setting it up. And then as we're going, it's been a few years since we've had Folio now. Supervisors now email this working group when someone is new to their unit. And so they need permissions added. And then if somebody leaves their unit, they'll email us and we'll remove the permissions. We do not have enough staff coming and going at one time to do this in bulk. So we do it individually, just as it's coming, as we get new hires, we add them in one at a time. Amelia, you can click the next slide, please. So our permission sets are unit specific. They vary depending on what the unit is. You could click, please. Just as an example, I've got 2 examples here. The Access Services unit divides the permission up by department within the unit, and then it further divides by department head, staff, and student employee. So here's just like a little example. You can see within Access Services, we've got branches, we have circulation, interlibrary loan, remote, and stacks. But then we've got circ head, circ staff, circ student. Circ student are going to have those very basic permissions. Circ staff will have that plus everything, everything else they need to do. And then the circ head is basically going to have all permissions pertaining to circulation things. Please click. And then as another example, we have our e-resources management unit. So this here are all staff roles. So they don't break it out by head, student, staff. These are all staff, but they have different jobs. So we have labeled them different things. We have an admin, a user, no delete, and view. But again, you can see everything starts with MSU, but then the unit. So we had Access Services before, and now we have ERM, and then it further breaks it down. So it's not the same by unit, but it makes sense for that unit. So that's how we did it at our library. Next slide. And then we like to keep track of what permissions we've granted to folks. So we created a Google sheet that the 4 of us share. If any one of us goes in and adds a new permission, we go into this spreadsheet. We keep track of the name, their email address, whether they're student or staff, the service points we've assigned to them, and then the permission sets we've assigned. And then just to keep things, I guess, pretty, but also organized, we did it by color. So that first chunk there is our art library, and then business library, and then digital scholarship lab. So every unit is its own separate section in color. And then we divide, so we've got students at the very top within each color, and then staff at the bottom in bold. And you can see just Spartan, for instance, works at the art library, but also the circulation desk. So they have 2 different service points assigned. So then when you go to their assigned permission sets, they have 2 different permission sets. They are a branch student, but they are also an Access Services circ student. So it's just a way for us to keep track of who has what permission in our library. Next slide. And this was a question that brought up that Maura talked about. So with each new release, it's really important to look at those permissions or to look at read the release notes. So our working group does that. We look at the release notes and determine what, if any, permissions will be impacted, and then we have to make the necessary changes in our tenant. And we do our best to identify what those are, but really we rely on the unit supervisors to let us know if something's not working. And we do get those emails. Hey, we just updated and this no longer works. So then we have to kind of figure out, oh, maybe there's a hidden permission or something. But for the most part, we do our best to make those changes. But every once in a while, something will happen, and we really heavily rely on our supervisors in the building. Next slide. So what could we do better? Probably a lot of things, but one of the things is we really could utilize permission sets within permission sets better. When we set up our Folio tenant, we did not do that. It was all the individual permissions. And so now I'm thinking, you know, do we go back and just make things look cleaner? Or do we just kind of leave them as they are because it's more work to go back and clean it up? But most recently, I had a special collections librarian ask me about, you know, modifying their permissions a little bit. And I looked at it and thought, wow, this is really messy. You know, there's a lot of permissions here. So I said, ooh, this is going to be my experiment. I went and I figured out what other permission sets out there do these folks need. And I was able to completely wipe out all their permissions and start over. And I realized they need everything that an MSU archivist does, everything an MSU cataloger, everything an MSU ERM viewer needs, and everything that an MSU selector needs. So I just plugged those permission sets right inside this one. The only permission that any of those sets didn't have is they do not have the ability to mark items as restricted. And special collection staff need that, so that's easy. You just add that one single permission then. So now we have 4 permission sets nested within this special collection staff permission set with one individual permission. So as we are making tweaks to things, I'd like to move more toward this. It just makes things a lot cleaner. And but it is really easy. So now when we have a new special collections hire, I just go in and make them or give them that one permission, special collections staff. Next slide. And then another thing that we could improve on is just more internal communication on what the various permission sets and workflows are in our library. We do get some confusion about, you know, why does this person need to be able to do that and why can't I do this? And so we just, I think, could do a better job of just explaining, you know, reasonings maybe behind our permission sets, or understanding each other's workflows better so that we don't have those questions and confusions. But for the most part, this works really well. Like I said, a new hire, they just email and say, I've got a new student in the art library. It's very easy for us to just go in, grab that permission, and plug it in. And I think that's it for our slides. Yep.
So any questions to Erin and Christine?
There's just one question, but it's matching the Folio permissions about what people can and can't do with what they're actually doing in their day-to-day jobs. And I can imagine going around like talking, like interviewing everybody, and what do you do most of the time, what do you do when things go wrong. There's quite a lot of like human work to get it right.
Yeah.
There is a lot of human work to get it right for people. What I can say in my experience is that and Erin chimed in a if you want, or Christine, but, one of the things that I did was that I slowly, without them knowing it, I began replacing the giant buckets of permissions with, you know, sets that I had created. And I did not tell them, so if someone new came in and I heard no complaints, I knew that I did it right. And, you know, after a suitable time, you know, which I would consider testing time, you know, that because it was easier than trying to sit down with them and, you know, make the time to do this. I was frequently stumped when it came to pinning people down to talk about this. So, I would just sort of like do it behind the scenes and see if anyone noticed. And if they didn't notice, then I knew that I had a working set and that, you know, this thing worked for this group. And, recently I've just started to tell people when they ask for new people for new permissions, I can say, well, as it turns out, we have this lovely new permission set called this. I think it'll do what you want it to do. Do you want to try it? And they'll be like, yeah, I want to try it. So, and, you know, they immediately like, they're on the bandwagon, they're really happy about it. They don't have to think about it too much. They can leave it all to you. And, you know, so it is, in that case, it's a lot more like taking the pulse and keeping your ear to the ground to find out, if there's a problem with a particular set, because, you know, oh, no, there's a problem. You know what? Let me try and fix it. Okay. And, you know, so far, it has worked out really well.
I'll get to this one in mind, but we actually offload all of our work. So the people that are in charge of permissions don't actually, well, we create the permission groups, but we don't decide what's in those permission groups. They get sent to matter experts. So like they go to access services, acquisitions, and we say, these are the permissions available. What do you need? And then we will create those groups. So that actually spreading out amongst so many people gives them the responsibility of making sure that they have the right things, and they can make things as narrow as they want. Like they can say, I only want this section of staff to have these permissions and that's it, maybe student workers. Staff, I don't care, just give them everything. Okay. If you're fine with this means that they can delete instance, or they can't delete instance, but they can delete everything in this inventory, this, yeah, I trust them, that's fine, okay. That's what you want, do it. So, but that offloading does actually help quite a bit.
Yeah, when we had a situation at our library where, kind of like an unspoken, undocumented rule that no one except technical services or metadata management, has bulk edit permission. However, public services staff needed the view bulk edit permissions to do this workaround with the list app because they wanted to get more bibliographic information in their list than what would be provided in the list app. So I trained them how to build a bulk edit query, how to view that query, how to download the matching records and all of that. And then I promised them, I'm like, okay, you're gonna have these bulk edit viewing permissions and you will be able to download the matched records that you are viewing. Well, I forgot to give them those actual permissions. And then later down the road, I was like, oh, gee, I need to give them those permissions. Well, no one complained, so I don't think that, you know.
They can even try it or they
Yeah.
can do something.
Yeah, exactly. So, just, you know, to be a good colleague and to be transparent, I sent a message to our head of, our AD actually for technical services. And I said, hey, I told public services staff that they could have these bulk edit permissions, but only view and build query and download matched records. I warned them that the expectation is that they will not touch inventory records whatsoever. And this is the workflow that, we needed permissions to do. I sent him a little screencast so he could see exactly what was what. And he's like, yeah, I think that will be fine for them to have the view permissions, but they do not touch the inventory records. I'm like, I know. So that's how we got around that. But I think it's really important to, not keep yourself in a silo, like, well, our department does this, and we need these permissions to do this function. And kind of see outside your silo and see, well, maybe if people in another department need like a minor piece of that permission to do something too. And that way, if you're transparent about it, you don't have anybody kind of freaking out like, oh my gosh, a public services person ran a whole oh my gosh, the world is ending.
Right.
So, right, yeah, it's just, the communication is key between departments.
Yes, I sometimes call that people wrangling,
Oh, yes.
you know, just sort of, let's just get all together, no problem.
I mean,
Nobody's
you know,
paying.
technically, I didn't really need to ask him for permission to grant these permissions, but like I said, with colleague, I asked for permission because I usually operate on ask forgiveness rather than permission.
Then just to add on to that, like just as we're not implemented yet, we're looking towards it, and a mix of to avoid this is what we expect, like circulation or these reviews, and to avoid these feeling of like, you know, what people should be allowed or not, but to go to the other way and think like people need to be able to do their job. And then also pragmatic that like at the beginning, like no clue how they're gonna do their job with Folio, and I don't want to start. We started off and we're going a bit iteratively at first. Everybody got access to everything in Folio, and then now we're at the stage, and it's a test system, they can't. And then the next step, what we did then is after the first like several months, they told us like, we're never using these apps. So we removed those apps. And now that we're in the phase, at least, it, like our timeline is much more concrete and we are going into more detailed processes. One part is going to be regularly like, within this, so you're already able to say like, are there things that we never use anyway, and that we can we take it away, or like we'll block it. And then to go into the more granularity of then who needs to view, edit, or if at some point we can't, because that's a question that maybe later. I really want to avoid, I really want to stick to the visible permissions because it's just easier generally. And they'll see whether we do have to delve into the invisible permissions afterwards. But anyway, so we went like, rather than thinking, starting with what we assume is needed and see if it works, we've gone the other way around, like a large permission and then taking away what in practice has not been used so far, to try and avoid the whole discussions of like what people think they're entitled to or not entitled to.
So that's the strategy that like I recommend when people do implementations, but like in the test system, everyone starts with everything. But the question I wanted to ask is, I hadn't really thought this through, like if you've been live for a while and you want to give people the opportunity to see the things that they never see, like do you have like open season on permissions in the test system?
Oh, yeah, yes, no, they can see some things in the test, but, we haven't had many requests from people to be like, oh, well, I really wanna see how this thing works in inventory.
Yeah.
You know, or I really wanna see how this works in circulation. Usually the departments are just interested, or seem to be interested in only.
We do have, I've run into some situations where we have librarians who complain to me that I can't do this because I can't see. It's actually a matter of them just not knowing Folio. And so it was a teaching moment where I sat down with them and was like, actually, this is how you do it, and you can see it and you can do it. So we've had that, but not so much wondering what else you can't do, but just really not even understanding what you can do.
Like your situation, like that would be really, like how would someone know that that even existed if they've never seen bulk edit? You know, they started after your migration, so.
So what we do is that in our test environment, the bulk edit lists, and I forget what the other actors right now is not active, the general staff members. It's only active in test, and it's only active for our subject matter experts. So for instance, the automation group has full access, they get every single permission to bulk edit. They are going in, testing bulk edit, seeing how it works, and then working out the workflow to figure out how it would work for their departments. And then they come back to us and say, we put the mission set that we would like, and then they get started to sign it out. So again, it's kind of like a way to throw it back out to the departments, let them figure it out. But the test system, I don't care. Like, if you corrupt data in the test system, it might make automation a little angry because they still use that for running reports, but it's not gonna affect patrons, it's not gonna affect billing. So if someone comes to me and says, I really want to test the serials app, that sounds really cool. Okay, here's all the permissions, have fun. And they gave me all the permissions to the system, so I.
People didn't want more, permissions because, most of the people, that I encountered, very happy not to have all the permissions. Because that means they will have to look at all the apps that they didn't care about, don't care about.
Yes,
Yes.
I think that's currently also the only way to also create your own UI kind of, or only the UI option that you really need for your job. And that's a big part of the solution creation, I guess.
There is a few people in our system that have those administrative permissions. I'm one of them, and you see everything. Everyone else is restricted to what areas that they work in, and we can drop it down even further. But yes, that is one thing that they do kind of ask, like, or they guys can get rid of that. So we will sometimes fine tune them.
yeah, there are some people who still have our original administrator set of permissions. And, they envy their student workers who don't have the extra little icons across the top so that they can just click on the one they want instead of going to the list of extra apps. And, you know, I'm waiting for them, you know, I'm letting them marinate a little bit longer so that when I say, hey, maybe we could clean up your screen for you, they will be more than happy to jump in and, you know, take it on.
And the more advanced testers have two accounts actually. They say, okay, for my regular work, I use the one with the restricted permissions because that's the only things I use. And for all the testing, for legal use or something, I will take my big one.
I am going to do a speed round of what Cornell does, mainly because it's similar to what everyone else does. Sorry, thank you. So there is basically 4 groups that do permissions. There's me, which I actually don't do anything. I just assign other people, which is great. There's a security group which is why I convene. It's a group of about 4 or 5 people. They're the actual ones responsible for setting up permissions, removing permissions, assigning permissions, all that fun stuff. We have our departmental experts, which I kind of touched on before. They're the people that say, these are the permissions we need in order for people to do their job. And then we have library HR, and library HR comes in is that I'll show later is that they actually will tell us when staff members are leaving and going. So the individual departments don't have to do that. So permissions are created when an app is added. As I said before, the head of the department or subject matter expert will tell us these are the permissions we need. As I gave the example with bulk edit, they go in the test system, test it out first, and then come back. One example of that is bulk edit is being used by our reserve staff. Our automation group, which is actually over data import, data export, and bulk edit, they went in and set up the workflows with reservations. Our reservation staff gave us a permission set that they wanted them to have, which sounds great, and then we assigned it to them. Because that's their area of the system, I don't argue with them. If they don't want an area of the system turned on, we don't turn it on. So we create or update our permission set, and then we also have a wiki that all our permissions are on. Let's see, so we don't assign any individual permissions, we only do the permission sets that are in Folio, so we don't do the individual API permissions unless we have to. And then machine accounts have a completely separate workflow. They will actually sometimes get assigned individual permissions just because they are being contacted by like our OPAC or our connected services, and we want to keep them as narrow as possible. This is actually our,
Thank you.
our example of our wiki page. So this is open to the public. So if you go here, we have 39 permission sets available. It's broken down by area, so you can see which area is what. It'll tell you what the actual permission name is and a description. And the description that's in here is human readable. I actually have another page that actually lists out the permissions that are assigned to each one of these. But then if somebody comes to me and says, I hired a new student, I need their permission for that. Okay, what ones do you want? I don't know, go to the wiki. But we've been live since Kiwi, so we know that if the math library says we have a new student, the security group knows that they need student assistant service level 2 because they need to be able to look at my fines. Things come in via Slack, email, or TBX. The support group looks at it, and 90% of the time we can just assign permissions to keep going. If we get one-off ones, like somebody who is in access services says they need full cataloging permission, well, we usually touch base with their supervisor or somebody in the department that says, yes, they're allowed to have access to this. And we'll usually see somebody in technical services and say, by the way, we're assigning these permissions because of X, Y, and Z. And then from HR, this is kind of a sample email what we get from them. This is part of their normal workflow when someone comes, leaves the library, joins the library, whichever will get this ticket sent to TDX that tells us the date of their change. And then that just actually gets queued in TDX. I had one person on our group. She's an IT and she is phenomenal. She is always on top of all these. I usually don't have to pay attention to these, but she'll go into the sign and remove permissions if needed. And then for removing people, we have, as I said, we do Slack, email, and that. The only other one I threw in here was Boomi. So all of our student permissions, when we originally went live on Folio, we were going to go in and wipe out our student permissions every semester and then re-add them all. I should add Cornell has about 300 full-time staff and about 120 student staff. So that's a lot of people. And this was key before it was even before it was not. What we found out though is with Bullmine is as soon as they graduate, their user account is deactivated in Folio, so they can no longer log in anyways. So we can take a longer time to clean up the permission sets in areas. What we have to do, we currently need to do a full review of our permission sets because if you look at them, you will see depreciated, do not use their permission sets. We have not touched them, but we're kind of waiting for the Eureka platform. We have talked to a hosting provider, they're supposed to be giving us a test bed as soon as that's available so we can play with it. But as soon as Eureka is set up on a test bed, we're going to go through all of our permission sets, go back to those matter experts and say, what do you need? These are where we can fine tune things, let them choose the sets we need and get those set up. And then the other one too is I've done this with other areas of the Folio system where the settings are dumped into wiki pages. So if you go to our wiki, you actually see our circulation settings on there. Those are all automated scripts that pull from Folio and throw on the wikis. I want to do the same thing with permissions. So I use the descriptor in Folio as a descriptor on the wiki, tie into those tags so that I can just run a script anytime permissions are updated and have them publicly available for that. That was my very, very quick overview of permission technology.
Sorry, it's not a question directed to this, it's a general question to, I'm written it down here, sorry. What's the trend with breaking visible permissions down to more granularity? I don't have an opinion per se, but I think I just want to understand, like, is the aim to get to as much granularity as possible with the visible permissions and or does product ownership development like set the limits? I'm just curious and like where, like, yeah.
It's not, that's one thing with everyone, you ask 100 people, you get 100 experts. I think it depends on the university. We have a tendency to take more of a, we don't think anyone's going to have any malice in the system. I think I've been at Cornell for 30 years now, 25, 30 years. I know one instance where a student actually did something in the system that they weren't supposed to. Yes. No. Yes, they were renewing a 2-hour reserve for 3 days at a time, and also back then they got out fines. So, that was on track down the law. So, and there was one instance over 25 years that we're having like that as the example that I could give. It's more of the oopsie, as you said, right? But I think if you're talking to a library where like LOC. they need and require, because of security restrictions, to have very, very granular permissions. From what I've seen with the Eureka platform, I think that's where it's going to commit. Where I would want it is those machine accounts. So when I have an external service connecting with Folio right now, if I have to give them a permission set, I have to give them like all read access to inventory. Maybe I want to just give them this one section of inventory. That's where I would want to bring in permissions.
Yes, I've been messing around with these permissions since Bellis. One of the things that I've noticed when it comes to greater granularity, there was for a long time, it would be like a thing that just said, function of circulation, checkout enabled. Or cert log something enabled, and then, in a later release, that would be deprecated and be replaced with get good full permissions. And so when I'm saying that they're breaking things out into greater granularity, typically what I see is that when they come out with a new function or a new thing to look at, they will start with just sort of like, enable something very large, and then it gets broken down into those smaller functions. So that's what tends to happen. Yes.
You want to try to do a screen?
Yeah, so I was also going to present on the 5 colleges permission structure and kind of how I use a Python script to automate our permission maintenance. I can zoom through this super quickly. So in general, our permission structure is kind of different from the other structures that you've heard about today. So our approach is one where we wanted to have these permission sets devised for different areas of working in Folio. So we have finance permissions that give access to the orders app and to the finance app. We have users permissions that give access to the users app. We have inventory permissions that allow a lot of different functions in the inventory app. And so within these categories, we generally break them up into 4 levels. The first level is view-related permissions. So in the first level of each of these permission sets, you're not going to be able to take any actions to modify records, but you are able to view these permissions or view records in that area. And generally, we're pretty free with giving out these view permissions and are more restrictive with the higher levels of permissions. So for our level 2, these are usually our edit permissions. These are things that most people working in the app will need to do. And typically, these do not include delete permissions. And they also do typically include the Finance 1 version of the permission set. Actually, Finance is an exception to that. But typically, we use the lower level version of the permission set in the next level up, so that when we have an update, a version update comes out, and we need to modify permissions, we don't need to modify each permission set. We can just modify the lowest level permission set that requires that permission, and it will cascade up to the higher levels. And then finally, 3 is usually deletion. And in the case of finance, there are a few more advanced things that are limited to only a few people in our acquisitions department need to be able to create fiscal years and ledgers and budgets. All of these things, executing the fiscal year rollover. These things are higher level. In inventory, this includes deleting records. In users, this includes the ability to apply permissions to users. And finally, we have admin, which this is usually our settings related permissions. We try to keep settings access out of staff hands generally. But for department heads who are regularly working with these things, or for our system admins, these permission sets exist. And then there are a few exceptions to this structure. We have these add-on sets, which are typically used, which that's our word, not a Folio word. These are permission sets for smaller apps like bulk edit and data import and export, where we really only have 2, maybe 3 permissions, where it's you can view, you can run data export, you can run a bulk edit, but it doesn't have enough. We don't need that granularity because the apps are a little simpler. Then we have invisible permission sets. So occasionally we run into cases where the visible permissions that are those static permission sets that come with Folio don't include all of the permissions that are needed. And so sometimes staff will run into errors. And to correct this, we need to apply invisible permissions to those users. And because you need to have invisible permission viewing enabled to view them in the UI, there can sometimes be errors if you don't have that enabled and you're editing a permission set that includes both visible and invisible permissions. So what we do is we just bundle those invisible permissions into a permission set that contains just all the invisible permissions. In this case, these are the data export invisible permissions, and you can see up here in our data export permission set, there's the data export invisible permission. So we kind of contain those to keep them separate and avoid errors. And then finally, for our integrations, so these are for our external scripts that are running API calls against Folio. We want to limit as much as possible what access those API users have. And so instead of using permission sets, we will assign individual permissions directly to that user. And typically we will go as granular as possible in that case. All right, so that was our structure. The script that I have that manages permission sets. Okay. The script that I have currently does a couple of things. It can pull down the current permissions assigned to users. And it puts it in a nice spreadsheet so I can look at it and make changes to it. And then I can push those updates back into Folio. So the way that the script gets the permissions is it makes a query to this user's endpoint, or to the permissions user's endpoint. And I have a query here by user ID. So that's the user records UUID. So we query with this GET request. And you can see here that there are these 3 permissions: UI users view permissions, UI users view service points, and UI users view. And this is what it looks like in the UI. Those are the visible permissions you see. So once the script has pulled these down and I've made whatever changes I want to make, the script will go through, and for each user, it will check against the current permissions in Folio, and if they're different from what's in my CSV file, it will make a put request to the permissions user endpoint, specifying the UUID for the permissions user. So that's, we go back, this ID here at the top for the permission user. You specify that, and in this case, I sent, for that same user, I removed one of the permissions. So when I make this put request and go over to Folio, you can see the permission is removed. So then with my script, it takes in a CSV file that I use to keep track of what permissions are assigned to each user. I have the script configured, so there is a column index for the user ID. So if I want to add extra columns of user data that doesn't relate to the actual function of the script, so for our student employees, I have a column for their name, a column for the department that they're in, and then the user ID. So I can adjust how many additional columns I have at the beginning, just to put whatever information I want to have in there. Oh, I also include the date that I plan to remove their permissions if I don't get told by their supervisor that they're staying on. So at the end of each semester, I reach out to all of our student supervisors and say who will be continuing for the next semester, and anyone who isn't continuing has their permissions removed, and anyone who is, I just update that date. And you can see here that the columns with permissions are using the permission name. So the script will query based on permission name to get the specific permission, because when you are submitting here, this is not that same readable permission name. So the script will also pull down that permission set and get the correct name that's used in there. And I'd be happy to talk with anyone who's curious more about this. And I uploaded this presentation to the schedule thing. So you can find the link to the GitHub for that project as well.
I just want to add for the record and for the meeting, there is on the wiki I can't remember what the name of the space is, where before there was proper documentation, information about apps were listed. Anyway, there is a section Erin Espy started it back in the day that explains a lot about permissions, and that, for example, explains in detail what you mentioned earlier about like careful with invisible permissions and changing them in the UI and these kind of things. FYI, there is like a lot of information explaining, you know, for example, the difference in the names and all of these kind of things, and you know.
And I would just add a caveat too, is I've done some scripting with permissions, be careful when you first start with the API calls and ensure like you know what the IDs are, user IDs are, because I remember, I think it's the user permission field you get the, I was mixing up the IDs. So like this ID.
Yeah.
I thought it was a user ID.
Because you could expect the ID to be the user UID from the user app, and it's not.
But it's
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, just be careful. I'm gonna poke around this crap.